Hey class, and welcome to Module 4. Now, this class is coming to you from Orlando, Florida, and not just Orlando, Florida, but the happiest place on earth. We're here at Disney World. Now, the reason I decided to do this lecture from Disney World is because, well, we're talking about agency law this week. And before we start, make sure that you read chapter 23 and 24. They both deal with agency law, and they both cover important subjects that we're going to be covering here in this week's lecture. Now, right off the bat, I apologize. It's really crowded and really noisy here, but hey, this is Disney World. 52 million visitors a year come here, and I picked one of the busier days. The weather was a little rough this morning, but it's clearing up now, and well, I decided to film our lecture here on Main Street. And the reason being is because when we're talking about Disney, and when we're talking about when we're talking about agency law, the acquisition of property here in Disney World by Walt Disney and the Disney Corporation is really one of the great examples of agency law. You see, Walt Disney wanted to obtain this property here in Orlando as early as 1959. Now, he opened up Disneyland in the 50s, and Disneyland, if you're not familiar with Disney, Disneyland's in California, in Anaheim, California. Now, at this point, internal research showed that only 5% of Disneyland visitors were coming from east of the Mississippi. He wanted a Disneyland for the east. And he also was a little irritated, Walt Disney was a bit irritated about how he didn't have control over the property around Disneyland. There was a lot of businesses that opened up around Disneyland that he wasn't really happy about. And he didn't really like how that transpired. So he wanted to start from scratch. He wanted a lot of property. Well, class, you can already guess what would happen if word came out here in Orlando that the Disney Corporation was looking to buy property to build a new amusement park or a new theme park. Prices would have skyrocketed. Now, it's hard to believe looking at this now, but this used to be basically just swampland. This land was next to worthless. And the Disney Corporation wanted to acquire this land. So what did they do? Well, they found an agent to purchase property for them. And here's the thing. If you read chapter 23, we talked about undisclosed principles and disclosed principles. In this instance, they were undisclosed principles. Nobody knew who they were purchasing property for. And in fact, Disney even took it a step further. They created dummy corporations. They created fake companies to purchase this property. These properties had very nondescript names like the Reedy Creek Ranching Company. In fact, a little loud here, but we're going to go ahead and continue on. We got a soundtrack for this lecture. Now, with that being said, the Disney Corporation created these companies like the Reedy Creek Ranching Company in order to purchase this property, because a lot of the landowners who owned this property, they didn't realize that its potential. You know, they didn't realize that this was being sold for purposes of building Disney World, because if they did, they probably would have held out for more money. Land sold for on average $200 an acre, and as little as $100 an acre. So Disney really purchased this land cheaply. And one of the things interesting, if you ever come to Disney World, is if you look at the signs up above and on the windows when you're walking through Main Street, a lot of the companies that were used to purchase these fake companies, these dummy corporations that were used to purchase this land, are immortalized on the windows here at Disney World on Main Street. So right there over Crystal Arts has a lot of the corporations like the I4, excuse me, and the Reedy Creek and Latin American Developments. These are all corporations that were listed, that were created for sole purposes of purchasing this property here. And they went ahead and used these dummy corporations. Now again, the real estate agents, the agents who were purchasing on behalf of this, they were purchasing on behalf of as an undisclosed principal. It was not revealed who the principal was in this transaction. And they were still technically liable. You know, we got into chapter 24, we got into, torts, and liability of agents and principals. But with that being said, this was an undisclosed principal, so they didn't reveal who the party was. In many instances, they didn't even know. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about chapter 24 and liability, but let's go ahead and grab a bite to eat. Right over there is a Main Street confectionery or candy store. They got some pretty good treats there. I'm going to go ahead and grab that. Let's grab something to eat there, and then we'll finish our lecture there.
Well, here we are, class, inside Main Street Confectionery on Main Street in the Magic Kingdom. And as I said outside, this is going to be a pretty neat place to grab a snack. Now, admittedly, it is like first thing in the morning. The park just opened. There are people everywhere, but nobody is starting off their morning having cookies and sweets. So that works out for us because, number one, look at this. I mean, this stuff is fresh out of the oven. It is really inviting, and this is going to be the best time to get some of this stuff because that cookie was literally pulled out of the oven maybe like 15 minutes ago. And we might get some snacks for later in the day as well. We got a little bit of everything here. To be honest, the main reason I did come here is not because I was really jonesing for a cookie. I normally don't have cookies for breakfast, but because this is probably the only place in the Magic Kingdom that isn't like ridiculously crowded. So, not a bad place to film a lecture.
Okay, class, we are in Main Street Confectionery here in Disney World. And I went and decided to come in here to grab a snack and to continue our lecture about agency law. Now again, as I said outside, make sure you read Chapter 23 and Chapter 24. Chapter 23 talked about what an agent is. We also talked about an undisclosed principle and how Disney was an undisclosed principle in their acquisition of this property here in Orlando, Florida, to help build Disney World. Now, with Chapter 24, we talk about the liability of an agent and a liability of a principal. And this is an interesting subject because, once again, we can turn to Disney for some great examples. There's a famous case, and I linked up to it before this lecture, involving the CEO of Disney back in the late 80s and 90s, a guy named Michael Eisner. Now, Michael Eisner, as CEO, went ahead and hired, after there was an unexpected death, he hired a guy, a good friend of his, named Michael Ovitz, to be president of Disney. They were good friends, and it looked like it was going to be a perfect fit. Problem is, Ovitz and Eisner didn't really work together well. It didn't really work out, and one of the complaints was that he didn't really fit the Disney culture. Now that's kind of corporate talk for we just didn't like the guy, because at the end of the day, they didn't really have a cause to fire him. He was doing his job. They just didn't have a cause for firing him, but they weren't really happy with his performance, or at least I don't know about them, but Eisner was not happy with him as president. So this deterioration of the relationship went on for about, I think it was 14 months. It was about a year, whatever the case is. And Eisner unilaterally fired him. Now the thing is, when we're talking about corporate payouts and we're talking about like presidents and CEOs, they a lot of times have a severance package. And Ovitz had a severance package. So Eisner had to pay him $130 million as a severance package. But here's the thing, Eisner didn't have to pay it. The person who had to pay it was Disney. So immediately afterwards, some shareholders of Disney sued Michael Eisner, saying this was negligent. You cost this company $130 million by hiring a CEO who wasn't up to snuff according to you, and then firing him after a year without going over it with the board, and firing him and forcing us, the company, to pay $130 million in severance. This became a famous case, and it's a great example of agency law and the liability of an agent. Now, ultimately, Eisner won. Ultimately, the courts in Delaware, because this was a Delaware corporation, ironically enough, even though it's here in Florida, and even though Disney is in California and Florida, we think of it, but it was a Delaware corporation. And the Delaware courts ultimately found for Eisner and said, well, this was an example of gross negligence. Ultimately, they prevailed. But it is a good case for looking at when an agent can be liable. It's not just the torts. We talked about that in Chapter 24. An agent could be an employee, for example, a truck driver, who, while delivering some of the products here, like say the chocolate chip cookies, to Main Street Confectionery. Let's say this delivery guy is under the influence, gets into an accident, injures somebody. Well, if he's injured while he's delivering food or while he's in the service of the company, then yes, Disney could theoretically be liable. However, if he does this on his own time, that's called a frolic or a detour, and that wouldn't cause liability. But I'm getting a little sidetracked there. That's ultimately the liability under tort law for agents, or the liability of principals to agents under tort law. But this was a fiduciary liability. This was basically contract liability, and basically they were arguing that Michael Eisner was negligent in his duties as CEO. But you know what? It's getting crowded in here. I picked this spot because it seemed pretty dead when I initially came in here. It's getting crowded here, so I better go ahead and try this food. And I just gotta say, I wanted to go someplace where Tigger was at because, like, you know, I gotta admit, I'm like, of all my favorite Disney characters, I love Donald Duck. Donald Duck's awesome, but I also love Tigger because Tigger's got like such a great outlook on life. I mean, he's like a great life coach if you want to get down to it. Because like Tigger was all like if you ever watched The Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, you know, like when Tigger first came onto the scene and introduced himself to Winnie the Pooh, he was like, "Yo, fam, you got any food, man?" And Winnie the Pooh was like, "I just got some honey." And he's like, "Man, Tiggers love honey, bro." And it was like, you know, he never had honey before, and he just went right at it. And he was like, "Oh man, this is terrible. I hate honey." But I mean, you know, that's like just such a great way to go about like eating food. So like for me, I was kind of like, you know, hey, that's like how I like go about eating food is like, you know, I totally love this. And I've never tried this chocolate chip cookie at Disney, but hey, you know what? Tiggers love chocolate chip cookies from Disneyland, or Disney World, excuse me. So, whoops, that was a bigger piece than I expected to break off. But, and I mean, I should have let you see it before I broke it. But I mean, check that out. I mean, look at that design. That's awesome. You know, I'm glad we came here first thing in the morning because this cookie is so fresh. That was good. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Tiggers really do love cookies. I also got an English toffee bar. Because again, Tiggers love English toffee. Check that out. Looks pretty good. You can totally get some awesome sweets here in Disney World. Well, class, hope you enjoyed Module 4. We'll catch you next week for Module 5. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email. We'll talk to you then, class.